just to bring the megatrends to life a little bit and demonstrate how we go about thinking about these issues in our investment process and also our ethical analysis. I'd like to invite to the stage four of my colleagues. Duncan Paterson. So we're going to do this in four parts. We're going to start by illustrating how we actually go through the ethical process. Now, Australian Ethical has an ethical advisor called CAER, and Duncan is the CEO of CAER. My other colleagues, come and sit down. We've got David Macri, Chief Investment Officer. We've got Andy Gracie, who's our portfolio manager for our Smaller Companies Fund, which is our flagship fund. And we've got Nathan Lim, who's the portfolio manager for our international fund. Now, we might actually kick off by Duncan, who'll just give you pick up on a few of the megatrends and talk about how we actually apply it using the Australian Ethical Charter that affects, impacts and informs all of our decisions. So.
Thanks, Phil. So, as Phil just mentioned, I'm the CEO of CAER, Corporate Analysis Enhanced Responsibility. We're an independent ethical advisor to Australian Ethical. We've been working with Australian Ethical since 2000, providing advice on interpretations of the Australian Ethical Charter. Whilst we're independent of Australian Ethical, we work very closely together on all issues, ethical issues and frameworks. So the Australian Ethical Charter, as you can see up here, consists of a set of positive statements that guides us on what sort of activities we might like to support when we make investment decisions, and a set of negative statements that tells us what sort of things we might want to avoid when we look at the companies we're considering for investment and other types of investments that we make. When interpreting the Charter, sometimes challenges can arise. So one of the things that we sometimes grapple with is that materiality test. As you can see up there, it says, we'll avoid companies where they're unnecessarily doing harm. What does that mean? Are we talking about materiality thresholds, revenue, breakdowns, that kind of thing? Is it a tiny involvement? Is it a significant involvement? We have to look quite closely at some of those sorts of issues. And also, we also look at issues about where conflicts arise between positive and negative things. So what happens when you want to invest in a company? The Charter's suggesting that we should support a certain activity, but there are concerns around that company based on the negative side of the Charter. So it's a very interesting exercise, and it keeps us all on our toes. One of the enormously satisfying aspects of working for Australian Ethical and working with the Australian Ethical Charter is that its tenets, the tenets in the Charter, mean that we've been looking for a very long time at the sorts of issues that mainstream investors are only just discovering. And these are a number of the sorts of issues that are emerging in the megatrends that Stefan was talking about. If, for instance, we look at Part H of the Australian Ethical Charter around human happiness, dignity and education, this means for some years that we've been looking at solutions to problems arising from an ageing population, things like healthcare, aged care, and implications for the financial services sector, superannuation, financial advice. What are some of the implications arising from that? What are the investment cases that come out of that? And so Andy will be talking about that a little later on. Part D of the Charter talks about appropriate technology. So what we mean when we say appropriate technology, we're actively seeking out new and emerging solutions to environmental problems. Renewable energy, new technologies in water management and filtration, genuinely novel ways of preparing our economy for the future. So there are a lot of really good opportunities for growth here, a lot of investment stories, and Nathan's going to be talking about that a little later on as well. Just looking to, we also look under Part E of the Charter, looking at the amelioration of wasteful or polluting practices. This is quite similar conceptually to Part D of the Charter, but when we look at the way that actually applies in terms of megatrends, this fits more into the more from less type scenario. So this is really picking out the low-hanging fruit in the sustainability agenda. So according to McKinsey, there are huge opportunities to generate improved environmental and economic outcomes by more efficient use of resources. Australian Ethical has been a long supporter of this story. We've got investments in recycling, waste management, logistics and information technology, all of which together go to improving resource efficiency and efficiency of resource use. In terms of some of the conflicts that arise when looking at, for instance, companies in the waste management and recycling sectors, one of the real challenges you face here is that while we like a lot of the companies, we like the services they're providing, we have to make sure they're not causing unnecessary harm to the environment in their operations. The reality is that recycling is by and large a pretty dirty industry. So, for instance, Australian Ethical recently engaged with an Australian company called Sims Metal Management over pollution concerns that we'd picked up at one of the US facilities that they inherited when they purchased a subsidiary over there called Hugo New. We got a very good response from the company in that case. They wrote back and advised us the steps they'd taken to fix the problem, acknowledge the problem that existed, and that's a very important part of the process. So we're always trying to talk with the companies that are invested in. Australian Ethical is very active in terms of engaging with the companies in their portfolio. Just looking now at the Silk Road megatrend, Stefan mentioned the Asian Century White Paper from the Australian government. I was actually quite struck to see that its first airing in Asia was actually in Laos, which is a country which has got fairly serious human rights concerns and extremely high levels of poverty. It's one of the poorest countries in Asia. So to me, that was an interesting juxtaposition of the opportunities arising from Asia and also the challenges that are inherent. So Asia offers fantastic opportunities for Australian business, both in terms of direct sales, through education, consulting services, and indirectly through the more cost-effective manufacture of goods. But Australian regulators and companies will continue to grapple with the challenges of doing business in this part of the world. Low wages, poor working conditions, often calls to pay bribes and facilitation payments. And this last one is a very critical issue for Australian companies. It's now illegal and a criminal offence for an officer in an Australian company to pay a bribe overseas, to bribe a foreign official. And that's causing all sorts of consternation for Australian companies operating in Asia because they're not accustomed to that limitation. At the same time as recognising the challenges, we should also recognise that Asia is likely to provide examples of environmental leadership to the rest of the world. So, for instance, if you look at countries like the Philippines, India and China, they've effectively leapfrogged a whole bunch of telecommunications infrastructure that we have in Australia by moving straight to the use of mobile phones. Much more efficient use of resources. If we look at India again, they seem to be developing a similar approach to this in their energy generation, where we're seeing quite a lot of uptake of solar technology in smaller villages around India. And if they go down that road, they're going to be developing a novel approach to distributed energy generation without relying on the centralised poles and wires based system that's currently proving so costly for Australian energy consumers. The other interesting and slightly counterintuitive from an ethical point of view advantage that countries like China have is that whilst there are human rights concerns with the government, they also have centralised command economies. And so if they suddenly decide that they're going to plant enough trees to cover 20% of their landmass, they can do it. They just go out and do it. It was interesting that Stefan noted the one-child policy. You talk about population control. China has shown us how to do it. It's quite brutal, but it's very effective. And they are genuinely going to be going out and committing resources to solving some of the problems that we're grappling with, and they can do it in a way that Australian governments and Australian bureaucrats in Canberra, we're based in Canberra so I can make jokes about bureaucrats, but they can only dream with that kind of influence and power. So that's a very interesting sort of juxtaposition. So, for instance, what they've done recently is things like banning the use of polluting two-stroke motorcycles in cities, improving pollution outcomes and so forth. So Nathan's going to be talking a bit about this in his presentation as well. So I'm just going to wrap up very quickly. CAER works to support Australian Ethical's implementation of the Charter. The Charter means that Australian Ethical is uniquely prepared to benefit from the megatrends identified in the CSI's report. So I'm going to hand over to Andy now.